Welcome back to Family Twist. I'm Corey, and this is part 2 of the conversation with author and journalist Paul T. O'Connor. If you heard part 1, you already know Paul has lived through an unbelievable family story. And in this episode, the conversation really settles into something I think a lot of people in our communities are going to recognize. Kendall talks about spending decades trying to find answers, from petitioning courts to placing newspaper ads in Arkansas, long before DNA testing changed everything. There's also a lot in here about identity, about growing up adopted, about feeling connected to the people who raised you while still wondering where certain pieces of yourself came from. And trust me, Kendall has thoughts on finally meeting people he actually resembles after years of hearing, "Oh, you look just like your parents," when he clearly did not. Paul also shares more about his mother's story, foster care, old records disappearing, and how much damage secrecy caused for so many families back then. It's one of those conversations where everybody's story is different, but the emotions underneath it are really familiar. Before we jump back in, don't forget Paul's book, The Missing Child, The Life She Lived and the Life She Missed, comes out on May 26, 2026. We'll have links in the show notes. All right, here's part 2.
How do you blame a kid for being born to his mother? You have to be born to your mother. You can't, as you're coming out the door, you can't say, I want to go somewhere else.
I know. I've always felt, as soon as I found out that my birth mother, was forced to give me up.
Oh, she was?
Yes. Yeah. The story goes in both families that my father and she, even though they were ridiculously young, wanted to stay together, wanted to raise me. I don't know if they wanted to get married, maybe so. And all of that was a non-starter. It was like, nope, you're going to give this baby away and we're never going to talk about it again.
And this is about 1970, correct?
Yep. And that's the story. My mother's younger sister, who has been really good to me, told me that once she remembered, of course, my aunt would have been like 13 when I was born. She, of course, remembered all of that, but she said, we didn't talk about you again in the household. It was not to be discussed. And my mother continued that because, to your previous point, none of her other children knew about me. Her husband did, but, that was before his time, with her. So it's a dichotomy. It's so interesting to me how my birth father's family has always been looking for me, and my birth mother's family was not. And so, which is why, I don't have the opportunity to live close to my birth mother's family, but it's why I was so drawn to New England to come and be near my dad and be near my 2 half siblings here and their children. It's just been a wonderful thing.
Now, are what I'm going to call your real parents?
Yeah.
Because I believe that the people who raise you are your parents.
Yes.
Are your real parents receptive to all this, or were they a little bit nervous?
No, not at all. First of all, they died very young. I was 10 when my mother passed and 16 when my dad did.
Oh, so.
But before my mother passed, I remember her, she had been ill for 4 years. So she knew she was going to die. I didn't as a 10-year-old. But she sat me down not long before she died and said, Kendall, if you have the opportunity to ever connect with your biological family, please do it, And so I knew I had her support. And then after she passed away, my dad and I would talk about it a lot, I'll help. He would say to me, I'll help you find them, and we tried. And when we petitioned the court to have the records, released and all of those things. And of course, back then they were not going to do that. And in fact, the man who had handled my adoption for my parents was an attorney, of course, and he had become a prominent judge in my home county. And I even, when I turned 18, I went to his office because he was a family friend. He came to my parents' parties and everything. And I remember going to his office saying, hey, I know you have details. Could you slip them to me? He's like, well, I'd rather not be disbarred. I can't do that. but he was very empathetic and
Yeah.
he hoped the best for me. And so I really had very few details. I just had my adoption paperwork, which gave my birth name, my birth date, and the hospital which I was born in. That's what I used as an instrument to try to find my family for the next 30 years. I think by the time I turned 40, I don't want to say I had given up, but I was just over it. I was sick of trying, to find people, and it was just one dead end after another. And I even tell the story how when I turned 18, I was born in Little Rock, Arkansas, and with the hope that anybody from my birth family would still be around there 18 years later, I put like half-page ads in their newspaper saying, my birth name was Scott White. I was born on July 14th,
Wow.
Trying to connect with it. The irony is that I know now that my biological grandparent, my mother's parents, lived in Little Rock. It's a very good chance that they saw those ads.
Yeah. Well, you already had the birth certificate, so there was, the going into vital records wouldn't have done you.
When my parents my parents took custody of me when I was 2 months old. But in Arkansas back then, they had to wait 9 months before the adoption could go through. And so in June of 71 is when my adoption legally, I became Kendall. But they, of course, called me that from the moment they laid eyes on me. But the document that they were given in June of 71 said that they were the people who produced me in July.
Oh, my goodness.
That gives me the creeps. How do you lie about, that this woman who'd never given birth to a child in her life gave birth to me 11 months earlier? Come on. So I always knew that information was completely false.
Mm-hmm.
I assumed that the time of the day and, those details are probably fine. But, and I do know that, I was born in the hospital now that is literally listed on that. But ironically, hopefully in the next few days, we're receiving my original birth certificate.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, which I've never had. I don't even know if my father is on it because he didn't know whether he was on it because he was living in Massachusetts and my mother was then in Arkansas. And so it'll be really interesting to see. So, because Arkansas finally released the record.
The records, in my case, the records worked kind of for me and against me. My mother was never adopted. She was put in the Catholic orphanage and she stayed there for 12 months. And then this Irish woman, and her husband from New Haven traveled the 35 miles north, and they took her as a foster child. Well, they immediately dropped the name Irina and started calling her Charlotte. And so they came back, and my mother had this very loving pair of older parents, 45 years old at the time. But 6 or 7 years later, we had one of those flu epidemics come through, and it killed her mother, Anna Fraser. And so just before she died, Anna said to her niece, will you take in my daughter? Will you take in Charlotte? And Anne Richard, that's her married name, did take in my mother and treated her like Cinderella.
Yeah.
Which was not. So she was responsible for taking care of the two little girls. One was a newborn and one was 3. Well, those two women grew up as my mother's sisters, as tight as can be. Where this helped me genealogically is that foster records aren't sealed. So my mother in 1939 or 1941, 40, New Haven is a big hub for defense industries. And my mother was this beautiful woman, as you can probably figure since I'm so good looking. That's a joke. She was probably wanting to get married, so she had to be able to prove who she was. So she went up to Catholic Charities, or Catholic Family Services, I forget what it was called at the time, and they provided her not only with her birth certificate, but with a document or two documents saying this is the same person. Mm. And she was then able to use that to get a job, in a defense factory, saying, proving that she's an American citizen, and she was able to use it to get married and all of that. So that way, her being a foster child really helped me. The records were open. Mm-hmm. The problem was Connecticut has no law on the preservation, or its law on preservation of foster records is considerably laxer than it is for adoption records. Had she been adopted, all of her records would have been open to me in 2017 when I went looking for them, because they have to be preserved for 100 years. And that was 99 years. But the people at Catholic Charities in Hartford, who are just amazingly helpful, and they went and they looked through this warehouse, and they found just one little clue for me. And they said, we ran out of space about 5 years ago, and we threw out a bunch of records, and I'm afraid yours were some of them. Otherwise, I would have the whole story of her being put in foster care twice. It was continuous. Anyways, so that's my story. And all these stories. I mean, I breezed through a number of your podcasts and reading some of the dialogue, and it's just amazing what people go through in life.
It is. And just thankfully how many people come out and they're still resilient and, and, doing good work with what they have had to deal with. I feel overwhelmingly fortunate. I really do. From my adoptive parents, to finding my biological family, it's been overwhelmingly positive. I mean, Corey and I, up sticks and moved 2,600 miles to be near people, and Corey wanted that for me. I mean, we'd been together since 2005, and he said, there's something missing, because I didn't have that piece of the puzzle. Biologically, it's so great to actually finally look like people. It's amazing because I often tell the joke about how my parents looked physically very different. My father, dark, had some Native American, ancestry in there, black hair. My mother was alabaster white with auburn hair, and I was this little blonde-haired kid between them, and I didn't look like either of them, but it was comical because they would run into friends that they hadn't seen, in years in our little town or wherever. And they'd say, oh, this is our son, Kendall. And undoubtedly the person who's meeting me is like, oh, I can see he looks just like, and even as a 3-year-old, I'd be like, stop. I do not look like these people, and it's okay.
That's a great story.
And they embraced that. It was fine. You know what I mean? Like, we didn't need to look like each other, but now that I've met people that I actually do resemble, it's like, oh gosh, you just are shocked.
Well, the interesting thing about these found cousins of mine is they're so different. Well, politically, and I won't get into politics, but politically, it's amazing that we argue as to how much, I shouldn't say it this way, we're astounded by how much we think alike. So if we have a difference, it's on the most minuscule one particular cousin who was the law partner of a very good friend of mine. So yeah, that was That was another coincidence, but they don't look anything like me. And I think that I kind of look like my mother's two sisters from her chosen family.
For sure. For sure. And to your point that you made when we first got on the call, I used to joke, knowing that I was adopted, I used to joke with every person I dated as a teenager. I'd be like, okay, so let me just, I was born in Little Rock. Please tell me you weren't that, thinking only 3 hours from there, I don't want to be dating anybody that I'm related to, it was just comical, but it was something that was a very real thought. It was like, that's gross. I don't know.
You want to be really, that's one burden. So my sister's two children and one of my best friends, his two children, they're Korean, because back in the early 80s, that was an easy path, somewhat easy path. It's getting children. My sister from the get-go had this big support network in the Boston area of Korean American children and their families. And I think that's a big part of why my niece and nephew are so well adjusted.
Mm-hmm.
Another is that I have a sister who's remarkable. And as my nephew once said to his sister, we hit a home run with getting this mother, which is a nice way of putting it.
Sure.
Yeah. So is there any way I can get a plug in for my book?
Of course. And we're going to put all that information in the show notes.
The Missing Child, The Life She Lived and the Life She Missed, by Paul T. O'Connor, tribute to my Uncle Ted, who was, after my father died, he was essentially one of my three uncles who became my fathers. I was raised with a pretty much absent father until I was 11 when he died, and these three uncles took over, and I got to go to more ball games and more good stuff. It was great. Taught me how to play hockey. So it's The Life She Lived and the Life She Missed. It's by Torch Flame Publishing Company out of San Diego. And it's available as of May 26th at your local bookstore or online. But when I found this podcast, and there were a couple of others in the same genre, I didn't get up with any of those people. But I just think it's so valuable for people who have this hanging over their head. I wish my mother could have listened to this.
Yeah.
They didn't have podcasts in 1994 when she died. But if she could have listened to your conversations and Corey's, it would have been so helpful. Because the stigma is so stupid.
It is. And it's sad when people think that one action that many years ago could haunt them for so long. It's tragic. And people need to tell the truth. Yeah, I can't ever be ashamed of the way I was created. I mean, was it common? No, probably not. I'm still here. Right.
Kendall, I think it's more common than you think.
Well, true. But I mean, it's funny because my adoptive mother would say to me, because they truly didn't know any of the circumstances of my birth. My father would say to me, well, your mother may have been super young, which is what was true. Know that. And they just said, lots of people are judgmental about girls having babies. And she said, that's okay because we got you as a result. And ironically, that's exactly what the story was. My fear all those years while I was looking is that I was hoping that either one of my birth parents hadn't died. And, I'm fortunate that they hadn't. I haven't gotten to meet my birth mother, but at least, the possibility's still there. She's still alive. That always went through my mind as a possibility, like they could not be around, but if I ever do find them, maybe they won't still be living.
Well, my mother never had any interest at all. And I remember asking her once, and I'm hoping this is a real memory and not just something that I've made up in my memory. And she said, I don't care about those people. She was bitter about it.
Yeah.
I understand that because it was a different time and a different set of mores in the society. But if anybody is listening to this and they have come this long and they think there's something wrong with being adopted, you need to go to church and talk to the priest or your minister and get straightened out, because it has nothing to do with the person you're looking at. And who knows what the circumstances were.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And, this probably makes good sense, but I feel so much like my adoptive parents' child. There's not a day that goes by that I'm not talking about them. Corey feels like he knew them, even though he never did, because we talk about them all the time. And what wonderful impact they had on me during my formative years. And yes, I lost them young, but their ideals kind of live on. And that's what it's all about, I think.
Yeah. And family is so important to everybody, even people who deny that it is.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the way I looked at it, I covered a lot of politicians, some of whom I just couldn't have disagreed with more. You have to keep your mouth shut because you're supposed to be impartial and all that. And I was, even though I was an opinion writer, saying this guy is such a jerk. He's doing this to people. And then you sit down at lunch and he's at the table and he's talking about, his daughter. Oh yeah, she's adopted and, and she married this guy, this black guy. And, so I have little brown grandchildren and I love them so much. And I'm saying, wait a second, I thought you were this, reprobate, horrible human being. And here you adopted children and now you're accepting of her decision to marry outside of her race. Okay. Maybe I'm the one that needs to rethink this whole thing. I still disagree with what you put in the budget, but
right. No, it hits home when you hear people's personal stories. That
is for sure.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for being on here. And
I've enjoyed it. It's been a great hour.
Yeah, for sure.
That was part 2 with Paul T. O'Connor, and I really appreciated how open this conversation was about the weird contradictions that can exist in these stories. You can deeply love the parents who raised you and still want answers about where you came from. You can feel grateful and still feel loss. You can find biological family and still have complicated emotions around all of it. I think this episode really captures that. I also loved hearing Kendall talk about what it was finally like to meet people he physically resembled after a lifetime of not having that experience. It sounds simple, but for a lot of people in the adoptee, NPE, and donor-conceived communities, that's huge. Big thanks again to Paul for joining us, and definitely check out his book, The Missing Child, The Life She Lived and the Life She Missed, available May 26th. We'll have info in the show notes. And as always, thanks for listening, thanks for sharing these episodes with people who need them. And remember, family secrets are the ultimate plot twist. Family Twist Podcast is presented by Savoir Faire Marketing Communications and produced by Mosaic Multimedia, LLC.